Welcome to Sputnik with me, George Galloway.
And me, Joseph Hyatt, standing in for Gayatri.
Last week we would have been celebrating the 60th birthday of the late and incomparable Comandante Hugo Chavez. Instead, we continue to mourn his loss keenly.
Chavez won more elections and referenda in fewer years than any political leader in history. But that didn't stop US politicians and media routinely referring to him as a dictator.
His successor, President Nicolas Maduro, has been carrying on the traditions of Chavez and also of winning elections. But that hasn't stopped the onslaught from the land of the free, home of the brave, the United States of America. And just like in the Ukraine that we'll be talking about later, the US just won't take yes for an answer, at least a yes from the Venezuelans. Joining us on board the Sputnik for the first time is His Excellency Alvaro Sanchez, the Charge d'Affaires at the Venezuelan Embassy in London. Your Excellency, thanks for joining us. A moment of reflection on the passing of the great chief, Comandante Hugo Chavez. Would have been 60 years old this week. It's a cruelly young age at which he was taken from us. My wife and I worked in the last presidential election that he won handsomely. He was a force of nature, unstoppable, except nature and illness took him from us. How are the Venezuelans remembering Hugo Chavez this week?
Yeah, well, first, George, thank you very much for having me in such an important occasion. As you mentioned, this would have been the 60th anniversary of President Chavez. Well, the legacy of Chavez, not only in Venezuela, but actually all throughout Latin America and even the world, is very, very visible. This week, for example, we are currently celebrating or commemorating the third Congress of the PSUV, the political party that was founded. It was the idea of President Chavez to bring together different groups, different trends from the less progressive movements, etc., into one single political party. And this week, as a matter of fact, we had our third Congress. It was evident the level of communication, working together of all the people that actually form part of this organization, this political party. And not only that, but also President Maduro himself said it in one of his addresses to the whole party, that from here on, the political party is going to actually participate more in the dealings of the actual government, which is one of the legacies of President Chavez, to have grassroots people actually operating and participating fully in government. So
this is it's not just a government of technocrats, but it's a government popularly based.
Exactly. You can tell that this is actually people's power. And as I said, our political tradition in Venezuela for many, many years, not only the years prior to the election of Chavez in 1998, but even before then, all throughout the 20th century, we didn't have much tradition in terms of actually having a solid grassroots organizations, and much less transforming those grassroots organizations into political power. That's what Chavez perceived practically from early on in his presidency.
Poder popular.
Exactly, yeah, people's power, and transformed that and brought those masses constructively into actually the whole governing process. Unfortunately, he passed away. There are many things that the popular people's power actually reached and were able to accomplish. For example, 30,000 communal councils were set up in Venezuela, and they were fully getting the hang of participating in government. But this level of participation that we're seeing with the Congress that is taking place in Venezuela, PSUV Congress, it really went to a great positive step. As I said, this was one of the major dreams of President Chavez.
One of President Chavez's election pledges in that last election in which I worked was that every Venezuelan would have a dignified house by the end of his presidential term. Is his successor, President Maduro, committed to that, and what are the chances of that being achieved?
I think it's really, really, really good to see that particular achievement in the Bolivarian Revolution. 500,000 social houses have been built in Venezuela for the benefit of the poorest people. Actually, many of those people lost everything they had in the landslides.
From the barrios which slipped down the hillsides, and they've been rehoused.
Exactly, they've been rehoused. Again, 500,000 social houses. I mean, it's easy to say it, but think about it. I mean, not many countries, not many societies have accomplished such task and such goal. And again, this was the idea, the craft of President Chavez in 2010. As soon as he saw the unfortunate circumstances in which many Venezuelans were in at the time because of these landslides, he immediately set up a whole plan, a state plan apparatus to make sure that this project was going to take place. And in fact, President Maduro has not but just continue with these fantastic programs. Recently as a few days ago, many of you probably have heard, because the news, and not in a positive way, but actually in a very negative way in this country and in many other countries, have been writing and informing about a process by which in Venezuela we currently took residents of an older building that were not in very safe conditions, and they were actually taken from that edification called Tower, David's Tower, and they were actually moved into a whole social housing complex, a dignified complex for these families and children. The media failed to recognize that they were actually moved to a housing complex.
And concentrated on the fact they were moved out.
Exactly.
Well, that's the media we have. Every child in Venezuela either has or is about to have access to a computer. You've built more universities than any country in the entire world. These are fantastic achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution. President Maduro, of course, is not Chavez. Nobody is Chavez. How is he doing in adjusting to the task of filling the shoes of such a very great figure?
As you said, it's not easy. Not only President Maduro, but no one in Venezuela, I would say no one in Latin America.
No one in the world.
No one in the world can actually fully fill Chavez's shoes. And I really don't think that the Venezuelan population, Venezuelan voters, are actually expecting from Maduro to be a photocopy of Chavez. What they're expecting from Maduro, I think they're getting it, which is leadership, command, knowledge of the situation. I mean, he's a very able man, a very experienced man. Let's not forget that he's a worker.
I knew him from the days he was a bus driver. We were members of the same transport union. That's one of the reasons why I was very close to him when he was the foreign minister.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, President Chavez's legacy is known, and it's so famous, and it's respected both from its critics and fans. What would you say would be the one key thing, obviously in the capitalist society of here, that really could be a constructive lesson learned from President Chavez?
Well, that's a good point. And from an economic point of view, well, I think in one of Chavez's legacies is that he was able to beat the capitalist system in their own game. What I mean by this, when Chavez came to power and he immediately said, like, well, we need to certain things need to change in Venezuela, the state needs to be more involved in the economy, there's certain industries that we need to nationalize, the social welfare system needs to be strengthened. Immediately, those people who know a lot about the economy worldwide said, well, that sounds very good, but that's not going to work economically, and therefore you're going to have lots of economic issues. Namely, you're not going to have growth in the country. Well, actually, before Chavez died, we went through an average growth of 4%.
Wow.
And this is something that no one really expected, taking into account that Chavez had changed the rules of the capitalist system in a way that was to favor socially the masses of the population.
The economy is the key. As Bill Clinton famously put it, it's the economy stupid. And whilst all other things, cultural and other foreign policy things, Venezuela's foreign policy is exemplary, an example to the entire world, and so on. But in the end, it's potatoes on the plate, it's production, it's consumption, goods in the shops, and so on. Venezuela still has some distance to travel on that front.
Yeah. I think we're currently, as a matter of fact, going through a major restructuring of the whole state apparatus. In the key, the aim, and President Maduro has been very explicit and has worked very hard in order to achieve, is to make sure that we continue to be socialist, but at the same time we need to be productive. How to do that is a process of, or a process that has been in place. That again, President Chavez always thought about that as well. But let's not forget that, well, you know about this much more than me, is that from the kind of colonial legacy that Venezuela and Latin America had for not just a few years, but for 500 years, and our dependency exclusively on commodities, and particularly oil, in order, even though we have been in power, the Bolivarian Revolution, for 15 years, in order to disentangle ourselves from that critical and I would say negative past that still inflict upon what we do economically and otherwise nowadays, it takes quite a long time. You will know the consequences of colonialism everywhere, and we're not an exception. So, but I think we have covered a great deal of a great path. And we're currently in the process of, as President Maduro said, of making sure, strengthening the productive sector, but still keeping in mind that we're a socialist nation.
Well, it was said by a very great Irishman, Oscar Wilde, that right-wing people knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Yeah. It's equally wrong, though, to know the value of everything and the price of nothing. Your Excellency, thanks very much, and we remember with solemnity, but also with joy, the example of your late president. Thank you very much for joining us on the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, we'll be looking at the linguistics of conflict narratives. Who are the militants and the extremists? Who are the moderates and the governments that need to be supported? I promise you, you don't want to miss it. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. The linguistics of conflict narratives has always been a fascinating subject to me, and nowhere more so than at the present, in the wars currently being fought out in Syria, Palestine, Libya, the Ukraine, etc. Ukraine now, in the Western narrative, has a government, without reference to the fact that it came to power by virtue of a Western-backed violent coup led by self-professed ultra-nationalists, some say neo-Nazi elements, who overthrew the actual government, that is, the one that had been elected by the people. Those who refused to accept the coup against the government they elected have become terrorists at worst and separatist rebels at best. The Ukrainian government is now bombing its own people, and that becomes something we must support, whilst the Syrian government bombing its own people becomes something against which we must intervene, i.e. bomb. In Syria's conflict, Al-Qaeda-type extremists are rebranded as moderate Islamists, except when they cross into Iraq, at which precise point they become extremists again, and so on and on.
And rather than by overt design, this Orwellian doublespeak seems to wheel into action by simple osmosis.
No minutes of a Cobra committee meeting ordering the linguistic bombardments exist, and probably no such orders were ever given, no such meetings were ever convened. It seems there's no need to. The media takes an invisible cue. Joining us to discuss this is Mamoun Al-Abbasi, a linguistics expert and also a respected analyst and writer, on many of today's battlegrounds, principally those in the Middle East. Mamoun, thank you very much for joining us. What lies behind the nomenclature? That's one of the points I want to get to with you. How do we decide what we describe different actors in these conflicts as?
Right. Sometimes the same act, if we are in favor of a certain government, the same act will be overlooked, maybe excused, maybe given context. If you see the bombing of the UN school in Gaza, for example, the bombing itself was condemned, Israel wasn't condemned, and then we hear about something about Hamas may have been placing rockets there. So once you take a side, the news itself is presented differently. Whereas in other places where the enemy is clearly defined, we highlight and repeat the ugliness of this enemy everywhere. Where I would slightly disagree with you is with regards to the Al-Qaeda-inspired militants. They've always been presented as the #1 threat, even in Syria now. Everybody's talking about how those militants coming from Syria, they're going to bombard the West. Security companies are ringing their bell. The airports are, taking extra measures. We're anticipating more grooming of Muslims and more spying on them, more informants. The fact that they are in Syria hasn't changed. The fact that the government of President Assad is not an ally hasn't reduced the main focus, which is on anything that is Islamist. So anything that's Islamist, even if it's if it's anti-Bashar, if it's Islamist, then it's the #1 enemy. It's the number one.
Well, it's the #1 enemy when it comes home.
Threat. Yeah.
It's the #1 enemy when it gets back here. But I was trapped in a lift, or he was trapped with me, with William Hague quite recently, the former Foreign Secretary, and I said to him this: you've been wrong all your life, but you've never been insane before. Now the policy you're following in Syria is actually insane, not least because the people you are encouraging with non-lethal military aid and money and political and diplomatic support to go to Syria and overthrow the regime there, one day they'll come back here. And I asked David Cameron on the floor of the House, what's the difference between the Al-Qaeda that we're going to Mali to help the French to kill and the Al-Qaeda in Syria that directly and indirectly us and the Americans are backing?
Well, to be fair, there are many groups on the ground in Syria, and the ones that are supported by the West are supposedly the moderates who are being fought by Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda ones and the IS ones, who incidentally, by the way, until recently, IS fighters have never been engaged in a single battle with the forces of Assad. They've always lived peacefully, and even the oil would be sold from areas under ISIS control into Assad. So we have all weird, strange alliances. The average Syrian who's critical of the government of Bashar, or as a refugee, has this conspiracy theory that ISIS is not just Western-backed, it's Iranian-backed. Of course, it's a conspiracy theory, but you must think...
An absurd one. We've actually seen the videos of ISIS massacring huge numbers of people purely on the basis of their religion.
If a large number of people think that way, it means there is some sort of different points of view on the ground.
In Gaza, Israelis are killed whilst Palestinians die. I have at least 50 examples in the multinational, international mass media of descriptions of 20 Palestinians, 50, 100 died today, whilst 1 or 2 Israelis were killed today.
Right. Yeah.
Killed and died.
Right.
The pursuit of tunnels and militants in Gaza, when 75% of the people killed in Gaza have been civilians, and most of those have been women and children, nothing to do with tunnels or militancy. So where does all this come out of? Just pure political bias?
Yes, and unfortunately the narrative is shaped not by politicians, by the media, who we know it's owned by a handful of people with certain agendas. So that's really unfortunate, but there's the context, the whole idea of occupation, the whole notion of resistance, the whole idea, according to international law, it's allowed. All of that is dropped out. Nobody's really focusing on that. But I don't want to be here bombasting just one side of the media. We must acknowledge that majority of international media, with no exception, take one line or another, and they have this worldview, like, let's say me and you agree on Gaza, and we agree on Ukraine. We don't have to necessarily agree on Syria, but there's been this kind of line, if you're at one station, you have one worldview when it comes to Syria, to Gaza, to Palestine, to Iraq, and if you from the other side, you have another worldview. And this looks like different planets. And if, let's say, a Martian watching, you wouldn't know who to believe, unfortunately.
But
the truth is
that's
really
true, although some stations acknowledge it and others deny it. I mean, the BBC, for example, calls other people state broadcasters, while is itself a state broadcaster.
But of course, there was that outrageous statement, wasn't there, by what many would call one of the world's top terrorists, George W. Bush, when he stated that there were states in the Middle East of the axis of evil. How much do you think that such statement has a legacy in today in terms of its impact?
Things have dramatically changed since then. Remember that these states that even the people he would call axis of evil, it was North Korea, Iraq and Iran. Today there is talk of rapprochement with Iran. We have an idea that the United States might be cooperating with Iran to fight ISIS. You have the Israeli joining in, being anti-ISIS. Everybody's become a friend. The Gulf states, the number one enemy to the Gulf states is ISIS, because they pose an extremist point of view that claims to be Islamic, that aims to overthrow them. So everybody's happy to join ranks. So things have changed.
Would you agree with the suggestion that George Bush suggesting that there were axes of evil existed? The majority of those countries he labelled was in the Middle East. Would you agree with some people suggest that this language as a term very much set a path of this kind of Islamophobia that we do see existing?
Of course, and this was, I mean, it's one of those cartoonish, presentation of things. It came at a time when Khatami was offering a dialogue of civilization, and he stopped the enrichment of uranium. So he kind of slapped this gesture with more escalation. And then we saw what happens with Iraq, which is totally unjustifiable, and we're still paying for the price for that. But it's that language.
Israel is the gravest case in point. Here we continue to endlessly receive a narrative that the Israelis are the victims and the Palestinians the perpetrators, when we know, and most of the people watching this show know, that the opposite is the case, that these people in Gaza who are being bombed remorselessly with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, are themselves, 80% of them, refugees from Palestine. They were driven to Gaza. And because they continue to exist and resist, by existing they resist, they are a mortal threat to the settler control of their land. How solid in the media, you're a media man, how solid is the Israeli narrative? Do journalists and broadcasters really believe it, or are they pretending to believe it?
I think it's difficult. They've grown accustomed to a certain line, which they've been used to, and it's difficult to change. What's happening, though, thanks to social media and other media outlets, they've been exposing what's really going on. So they've been caught off guard. At one point, they continue with this old-fashioned, archaic narrative. On the other hand, the youth, the people who follow social media, have noticed there's a different story going on. We've mentioned the one in Gaza, for example. You say there's the idea of a conflict. There is no conflict. There is an occupation. There's a tremendous disproportionate use of power. There's no conflict between two equal sides. And that's why we've got many people so very much unhappy with how the mainstream media is reporting things. That's why people are going out in the thousands in protest. I mean, there was a protest against even BBC coverage. People, you shouldn't protest that. You should be protesting an atrocity, But to the extent that you're going out and protest away certain channels is covering an event, it means many people are really, really fed up of that. And this is, thanks to social media and the alternative that, cash in that, and they would, fill that niche. So people are aware, luckily.
Mamoun, thanks very much
Thank you.
helping us through that thicket of misinformation. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Joseph?
Well, on the, obviously, anniversary of President Hugo Chavez's birthday, Oko Bolo says, Hugo Chavez will be remembered in the same light as Che Guevara, hero. And Sukan Jallo says, a legend, Che Guevara would have been proud. There is no easy walk to self-determination anywhere.
Absolutely right.
And of course, on the point of the linguistics and how obviously terminology affects the international community, Secunda says, social media debunking mainstream media lies. Media no longer reporting news but playing politics.
I think that the political class and the media class are way behind the curve on this. They have not quite grasped how momentous the change of paradigm is by the impact of social media. You know that in the Great 2 Million March in 2003 against the war in Iraq, it's very difficult to find footage of it because camera phones hadn't been invented yet. And just 11 years later, everyone has a camera phone. Everyone is therefore a potential citizen journalist. And the citizen journalists can usually be trusted more than the ones we pay to be journalists.
That's all we've got time for this week, sir.
Which, unfortunately, means that's the end of the show.
Follow us on Twitter, it's RT_Sputnik. And of course on Facebook, it's Sputnik on Russia Today. But from me, Joseph Hyatt, it's goodbye.
And from me, George Galloway, it's been marvellous.